Welcome to the most deleted, shadow banned, demonetized, censored, and trolled channel on social media. Recipient of the Patriot Warrior Purple Q Award. Before we start, allow me to welcome our new sponsor, Attorneys on Retainer. If you are ever involved in a self-defense situation, the physical conflict could be the least of your problems. The legal fees could ruin your life as the aftermath of your self-defense actions. Attorneys on Retainer has you covered with not one, but a team of 4 lawyers who specialize in self-defense cases. AOR is not an insurance company. They are a law firm that has you covered. In a world of increasing senseless violence and home invasions, you cannot afford to not be protected. AOR will cover any bail and all legal expenses and provide you with a team of 4 attorneys in self-defense case gone sideways. For about $1 a day, you can rest assured that you will not be ruined financially by legal expenses if you get involved in a bad situation. The links are in the description, and you can use a screenshot of the following screen referral code for a discount on your membership. Get covered now. Attorneys on Retainer. Call 866-404-5112, and the referral code is DA342NI329.
The United States did not fire a single missile. It did not deploy ground troops. It did not launch an air campaign. It did not do any of the things that conventional military logic would prescribe against a regime that closed the world's most important waterway and dared Washington to respond. Instead, it did something far more devastating. It waited. And while it waited, something began happening inside Iran that no external military force could have. Engineered, that no sanctions regime could have produced, that no diplomatic pressure campaign in the history of this conflict had ever come close to achieving. Iran began destroying itself, not slowly, not subtly, visibly, violently, with soldiers abandoning their posts in groups, with protests burning across dozens of cities simultaneously, with 2 armed forces inside the same country refusing to send ambulances to each other's wounded, with a foreign minister called stupid on state television by his own military's media, with a supreme leader in a coma, with generals and diplomats and the Iranian people all pulling in completely opposite directions at the same time. The trap the United States built at Hormuz was not designed to defeat Iran from the outside. It was designed to make Iran defeat itself from within. And it is working in ways that are more complete, more rapid, and more structurally devastating than anyone in Washington publicly predicted. And what is happening inside Iran right now is not a government crisis. It is not a political dispute. It is not a negotiating posture designed to extract better terms from the Americans. It is a civil war, fought in corridors instead of trenches for now, but a civil war nonetheless. And the clock that ends it is already running. To understand the trap, you have to understand its architecture, because what the United States has constructed at Hormuz is not a conventional blockade. It is a 3-dimensional weapon, and the most devastating dimension is not the one with the warships. The first layer is military. Ships are stopped. Naval superiority is overwhelming and uncontested. The U.S. carrier strike groups, destroyers, submarines, surveillance drones, and maritime patrol aircraft have made the strait and the waters beyond it into a zone of total American dominance that Iran's remaining naval capacity cannot challenge. That layer is real, and it is effective, and it generates the physical consequences of the blockade. The second layer is economic. Oil cannot leave Iran. Refined fuel cannot enter. The revenue that finances the Iranian state, the IRGC's budget, the proxy networks, the soldier salaries, the government subsidies that maintain the fragile social contract between the regime and the population, all of it is being cut off simultaneously. Iran was exporting 1,850,000 barrels of oil per day before the blockade began, generating approximately $150 million in daily revenue. So that revenue is now zero. Storage tanks are filling toward capacity. The geological clock on well shutdown is running. The economic damage is compounding every hour. But the third layer is the one that makes this blockade historically unique. And it is the one that the regime's factions cannot defend against because it does not attack from outside. It attacks from inside. The United States kept Hormuz open for everyone except Iran. Saudi oil flows, Emirati oil flows, Qatari oil flows. Commercial shipping moves through the strait with American naval protection. The world economy is largely unharmed. Global trade continues. The humanitarian argument that Iran counted on, the argument that closing or controlling Hormuz would generate international pressure on Washington to back down because the world needs that waterway, collapsed immediately when the U.S. simply opened the strait for everyone else and let the isolation fall entirely on Tehran. Every possible Iranian response makes the situation worse. Close the strait further, the U.S. opens it. Mine the waters, the U.S. clears the mines and tightens the port blockade. Fire on tankers. The U.S. seizes Iranian-linked ships in international waters and demonstrates that there is no ocean deep enough to hide from American interdiction. Negotiate. The IRGC brands it treason. Refuse to negotiate. The economic clock runs out before the diplomatic window opens. This is the trap. Whatever Iran does, it loses. Whatever it does not do, it loses. And the United States understands this with a cold strategic clarity that is reflected in Washington's most powerful tactical choice. It is not hurrying, it is waiting. Because every day that passes without resolution, the pressure inside Iran builds and the options available to the regime narrow. The trap does not need to be tightened. It only needs to be maintained. And maintaining it is exactly what the U.S. Navy is doing. What that trap has produced inside Iran is a fracture so complete that the regime has stopped functioning as a single country. 3 powers, 3 strategies, 3 survival plans, none of them accepting the others. The first power is the IRGC Corps, led by Commander Ahmad Vahidi, a man whose personal history includes command responsibility for bombings and assassinations stretching from Lebanon to Buenos Aires, who carries an Interpol notice from Argentina, and who was appointed to lead Revolutionary Guards on March 1st under circumstances that tell you everything about where the hardline faction's priorities lie. Vahidi's position is absolute. The war must continue. Escalation must proceed. Negotiations must be rejected. Diplomatic outreach is treason. But here is what makes Vahidi's position more than just ideologically extreme. It is institutionally existential. The IRGC is not simply an army. It controls an estimated 30 to 40% of Iran's domestic economy. Construction companies, telecommunications networks, oil contracts, banking operations, ports, airports. It is an economic empire that has been built over 45 years using the revolutionary legitimacy of the organization as cover for the accumulation of commercial power that would be impossible without the conflict narrative that justifies the IRGC's dominance, without an external enemy, without active conflict, without the resistance economy doctrine that tells Iranians that sacrifice is necessary and that the IRGC's role is to protect them from enemies on every side. The IRGC's economic empire becomes a political question. Why does a military organization control banking? Why does it hold telecommunications contracts? Why does it manage port operations? These questions do not have comfortable answers in peacetime. They only have defensible answers inside the framework of permanent revolutionary struggle. Peace is not just a policy disagreement for the IRGC. It is an existential threat to the institutional architecture that has made the Revolutionary Guards the wealthiest and most powerful non-state actor in Iranian history. So Vahidi calls for escalation from a position of collapsing credibility because the IRGC's own operation to break the blockade failed in 20 minutes. Iranian naval forces attempted to challenge the American presence and were neutralized without meaningful resistance. The deterrence that Iran had spent decades building in the strait, the fast boat swarms, the coastal missiles, the mine laying capacity, all of it tested against real American naval power and found catastrophically insufficient. And the hardliners are now calling for escalation from inside an organization whose own personnel are going without salaries because the revenue lines that funded them have been cut. A military empire whose soldiers are not being paid is not an institution in a position to win a war. It is an institution in the early stages of internal collapse, dressed up in the language of revolutionary resolve. The second power is the diplomatic and presidential wing. President Pezeshkian, Foreign Minister Aragchi, Parliament Speaker Galibaf, and they are fighting for their lives. On April 20th, Pezeshkian made a public statement that landed inside the regime like a detonation. If the conflict continues, Iran faces a massive reconstruction crisis. No funding, no market stability, infrastructure in ruins, war damage, standing at $270 billion. Steel, petrochemical, and energy infrastructure severely damaged. Isfahan's industrial zones struck. Port infrastructure at Bushehr and Bandar Abbas degraded. The currency at its lowest point in history. And then the line that transformed a policy statement into something approaching a revolutionary act within the context of a regime that has never publicly acknowledged the consequences of its own decisions. The truth must be told to the people, otherwise trust in government will completely erode. For the hardliners, this was not a policy difference. This was switching sides. Because if you tell the truth about what this war has cost, you cannot explain why the war should continue. You cannot sustain the 87% war support figure that state television presents without naming a single polling organization, without citing a single data source, without providing any methodology whatsoever, and expects a traumatized population to accept as established fact. Kalibaf went further. In a meeting with advisors, exclusively reported by Iran International, the parliament speaker described senior IRGC-aligned figures as extreme militia-like actors who will destroy Iran. He said state television was being mobilized against negotiations. He expressed fear of being removed from his position. He worried that Araghchi would also be ousted. The head of Iran's parliament, officially one of the most powerful figures in the Islamic Republic, is afraid of being toppled by the organization he is supposed to help govern. Araghchi announced on April 17th that Hormuz was open to all commercial vessels. He was attempting to signal flexibility to international partners, to create the diplomatic space for a second round of talks in Islamabad, to demonstrate that the government was capable of offering something. The IRGC opened fire on tankers the same day. State television called Araghchi stupid in public, on air, by name. The country's foreign minister, publicly humiliated by his own military's media while conducting official diplomatic functions, is not a government experiencing internal tension. It is a government that has ceased to function as a unified entity in any meaningful operational sense. But the faction that the regime fears most of all is the third one. It does not meet in corridors. It does not issue diplomatic statements or IRGC press releases. It stands in fuel lines that stretch for blocks. It shuts shops that cannot get stock because supply chains have collapsed. It drives trucks that have stopped on roads because refined fuel is unavailable or unaffordable. It chants death to the dictator on streets in Tehran and Isfahan and Shiraz and dozens of other cities simultaneously. It is the Iranian people, and their patience ran out a long time ago. Iran's social contract, the unspoken arrangement that allowed the regime to maintain control for 45 years, was always fundamentally economic rather than ideological. It was not democracy, but it was cheap gasoline. It was not freedom, but it was bread on the table. It was not dignity, but it was basic needs met in exchange for political compliance. The blockade tore that contract apart. No gasoline, no diesel, daily power cuts. Inflation exceeding salary growth. Basic necessities becoming unaffordable. Factories shutting down because energy supplies have been cut. Hospital generators running out of fuel. Iran is the world's fourth largest oil producer. Lines are forming at gas stations because Iran cannot refine enough of its own crude to meet domestic demand. The refined fuel imports that bridge that gap can no longer get through. The absurdity of that image, oil-rich Iran with empty gas stations, hits the regime's most sensitive political nerve because it makes the cost of the IRGC's choices visible and undeniable to every Iranian who joins a fuel line. The protest geography has changed in ways that are strategically critical for the regime's suppression capacity. In 2009, the uprising was concentrated in Tehran. In 2019, the flashpoints were specific cities triggered by a gasoline price shock. The IRGC's suppression model was built for concentrated urban unrest, pile forces into the problem cities, restore order through overwhelming presence, then manage the aftermath through arrests, trials, and controlled messaging. That model is breaking against what is happening now. Protests are erupting across dozens of cities simultaneously, from the major urban centers to provincial towns that never featured in previous protest waves. The regime cannot suppress everywhere at once. While it crushes one city, another ignites. While it moves forces to one province, another province sees crowds forming. The IRGC is being asked to simultaneously fight a war it is losing, manage an internal fracture with the government that is consuming institutional energy, pay soldiers it cannot currently afford to pay, and suppress a popular uprising that is larger and more geographically distributed than anything it has faced since the revolution. It cannot do all four, and the one it is choosing to prioritize, maintaining the war machine, is the one that is accelerating the other three. And then there is the military dimension that no state television broadcast has touched, and that represents perhaps the most structurally alarming development in this entire crisis. Iran has two armies. They have hated each other for 45 years. Artesh is Iran's conventional military force, inherited from the Shah era, filled through mandatory conscription with soldiers whose ideological commitment to the Islamic Republic is often limited and whose institutional identity predates the revolution entirely. The regime never trusted Artesh. After 1979, it created the IRGC precisely because it could not trust a conventional military that it had not built from ideological foundations. For 45 years, the IRGC has been treated as first class. Best weapons, best salaries, best hospitals, privileged access to economic contracts and commercial opportunities that have made Revolutionary Guards officers wealthy in ways that Artesh counterparts cannot approach. Artesh soldiers have been treated as second class within their own country's military structure, drafted into service for a revolution they did not choose and compensated accordingly. That resentment has now reached a breaking point under conditions that expose it with maximum brutality. Frontline Artesh units suffering significant casualties under bombardment requested medical evacuation and hospital access from IRGC forces operating in the same theater. The IRGC refused. Citing ambulance shortages and blood supply constraints, Revolutionary Guard personnel declined to transport wounded Artesh soldiers to IRGC medical facilities. Artesh soldiers are dying of wounds that could be treated. IRGC forces with access to medical infrastructure are watching them die and citing logistics. That is not a military organization experiencing stress. That is two armed forces that have become enemies while wearing the uniforms of the same country. The material situation confirms the depth of the collapse. Some frontline units are being issued 20 rounds of ammunition for every 2 soldiers, 20 rounds total. An automatic weapon fires 10 rounds per second. The combined firepower of 2 soldiers lasts 2 seconds of sustained fire. Units are reporting operations without reliable access to drinking water or adequate food. Fields of soldiers, nominally part of a military that claimed regional dominance and deterrence capability for decades, are hungry, thirsty, and functionally unarmed. The IRGC missile units, the regime's crown jewels, the best resourced and most ideologically reliable forces in the Iranian military architecture, are experiencing communication equipment failures and basic supply shortages. The commander's response to this has been revealing in its priorities. Technical components for missile system maintenance are being delivered. Food and personal equipment for the troops operating those systems are not. The machine must be maintained. The soldiers can go hungry. That command philosophy, expressed in logistics decisions that every soldier in those units can see and feel and draw conclusions from, is producing a predictable result: mass desertion. Not individual soldiers making private calculations and slipping away in the night. Groups, formations, soldiers abandoning bases and seeking refuge in nearby towns in numbers large enough to constitute a military phenomenon rather than a disciplinary problem. The regime attempted reserve mobilization to replace the losses. The result was described by informed sources as a complete fiasco. Most of those called up did not report. Some used the mobilization order as a signal to take their families and move toward border regions. The order to come and fight produced people moving toward the exit. When a country's mobilization order accelerates civilian migration, the state's authority over its own population has reached a terminal threshold. And the protests themselves have begun targeting the division that Artesh soldiers are living. The army is what the Peakle chants, rising from protest crowds in multiple cities, are not simply an expression of hope. They are a direct communication to Artesh commanders. They are an invitation. They are the civilian population asking the conventional military, the one that the regime never trusted, the one that has been treated as second class for 4 decades, the one whose wounded are being left to die by Revolutionary Guard personnel citing ambulance shortages, to make a choice. That question, once asked loudly enough and publicly enough and geographically widely enough, cannot be unasked. Every Artesh commander hearing those chants is running a calculation that the regime cannot control and cannot monitor with sufficient precision to interdict. If that calculation shifts, if enough conventional military officers decide that the regime's survival is not worth defending with their bodies and their units, the entire suppression architecture collapses simultaneously. The diplomatic wing understands this and is attempting to turn it into leverage. According to the Critical Threats Project's analysis, Fauci and Pezeshkian's team have been quietly exploring whether Artesh commanders can be brought to their side of the internal conflict. Not a coup in the traditional sense. An alignment of institutional interests between the diplomatic faction and the conventional military that would shift the internal balance of power away from Vahidi and the IRGC core. The IRGC reads any Artesh movement toward the diplomatic wing as precisely what it would be: a coup attempt. And when the IRGC identifies something as a coup, its response is not proportionate. It is absolute. Washington knows this. That is why it is waiting. Because the most dangerous moment in this crisis is not the one where Iran agrees to negotiate. It is the one where Vahidi decides that the internal threat from the Artesh diplomatic alignment is more urgent than the external threat from the American blockade, and turns the IRGC inward. A regime turning its military apparatus against its own armed forces in a country where the population is already in open revolt and the economy is days from well shut down is not a regime that stabilizes. It is a regime in its terminal convulsions. Outside Iran's borders, The isolation that the blockade has produced has reached a point that would have been unimaginable even 3 months ago. China, the country that purchased 90% of Iran's oil exports, that signed a 25-year strategic partnership with Tehran, promising hundreds of billions in investment, that provided diplomatic cover in international forums and technological support, that kept Iranian infrastructure functioning under Western sanctions pressure, has gone quiet. Not supportive? Quiet, which is its own kind of message. Xi Jinping's phone call went to Saudi Arabia, not Iran. Beijing's foreign ministry statements prioritize Hormuz remaining open as an international waterway. Chinese ships are being fired on by the same IRGC forces that Beijing's partnership was supposed to align with. And China's energy security, its UN trade strategy, its Gulf commercial relationships all require a functional Hormuz that Vahedi's tanker shooting policy is directly threatening. China is not saving Iran. It is calculating whether Iran's further weakening serves Chinese interests better than Iranian stabilization does. And the answer to that calculation is not obviously in Tehran's favor. Russia's position is equally cold beneath the surface solidarity. Foreign Minister Lavrov condemned the U.S. blockade as unlawful and defended Iran's nuclear rights at the Antalya Diplomacy Forum, and then stated in the same forum that Russia is ready to supply energy resources to China and other countries affected by the crisis. Russia is advertising its readiness to replace Iranian oil in Chinese markets while performing solidarity with the country, whose market share it is preparing to capture. Every barrel Iran cannot export is a barrel Russia can sell. Every week the blockade holds, Russian energy revenues grow and Beijing's dependence on Moscow deepens. Russia's support for Iran is the support of a competitor who needs the partnership narrative while profiting from the partner's collapse. The proxy network that constituted the concrete expression of Iran's regional power for 40 years is evaporating alongside the financial flows that sustained it, as well as senior leadership and command structure have been systematically eliminated. Hamas has been crushed in Gaza. The Houthis are in direct naval combat with American forces and running the calculation about whether continued escalation in the Red Sea saves Tehran or accelerates an Israeli-American strike on their own positions. Iraqi militias are retreating under pressure from the Baghdad government. Every organization in the axis of resistance watched the IRGC's operation fail in 20 minutes in its own territorial waters and drew the same conclusion. If Tehran cannot protect its own strait, it cannot guarantee anyone else's security. If Iran cannot guarantee security, the logic of dying for Tehran collapses. Once that question is asked inside these organizations, it cannot be unasked. The 40-year project of regional power projection, built through proxy networks and resistance ideology, was sustained not by military might alone, but by the perception that the center could hold. That perception is broken, and broken perception cannot be rebuilt with money that no longer exists. 10 to 14 days. That is the window before Iran's oil storage capacity fills completely and well shut down becomes unavoidable. Oil well shut down is not a policy decision that can be reversed at a committee meeting. It is a geological event with permanent consequences. When underground pressure is released through shutdown under these conditions, reservoir damage begins that can take months to repair. In the best case, and in the worst case, permanently reduces production capacity. Some wells, shut down under sustained blockade conditions with full storage and no export relief, will not fully recover. The blockade is not just cutting Iran's current revenue. It is permanently degrading the asset base that would generate future revenue after any deal is reached. Every day the clock runs forward, the economic damage of a potential future settlement gets worse, which shrinks the space in which a deal is viable, which extends the blockade, which runs the clock further. Iran's refinery paradox makes this inescapable in the most visible possible way. The country produces crude oil at massive scale, but cannot refine enough of it domestically to meet its own consumption. It exports crude and imports refined products. The blockade has sealed both ends of that loop simultaneously. Nothing leaves, nothing enters. And the result is fuel lines in an oil-producing nation that communicate the regime's failure to every citizen, who joins them more powerfully than any opposition messaging ever could. Pezeshkian says urgent negotiation. The IRGC blocks every channel. Ghalibaf wants a deal and looks over his shoulder for the knife Vahedi is sharpening. Fauci announces the strait is open and watches the IRGC contradict him with live fire the same day. The comatose supreme leader cannot provide the authorization the system requires for any major decision. The imaginary approval that Ghalibaf is obtaining from Mojtaba Khamenei's intensive care room is the constitutional fiction on which whatever remains of Iranian governance is currently running. 4 men from the barracks of Mehdi are running out of time to decide whether Iran survives or burns. They know each other's files. They know each other's failures. They have been competing for the same promotions and settling the same personal scores for 40 years. And they are now making existential decisions about a nuclear-armed state's future under conditions of maximum external pressure, zero financial runway, internal military collapse, and a popular uprising that is running out of patience faster than the oil storage is filling. The United States has not attacked Iran. It has engineered the conditions under which Iran attacks itself, made the IRGC's war doctrine financially unsustainable, while that same doctrine is destroying the diplomatic options that could relieve the financial pressure, made the regime's social contract with its population impossible to maintain while the internal conflict prevents the decisions that could restore it, made every Iranian faction's survival strategy contingent on defeating the other factions before the clock runs out, while ensuring there is not enough time for any faction to decisively defeat the others before the situation becomes irreversible. This may be one of the most strategically sophisticated operations in modern American military and economic history. Not a war, a trap, set with warships and sanctions and patience, baited with oil revenue and proxy network financing and regime legitimacy, closed by the IRGC's own institutional imperatives. The U.S. did not need to attack Iran's government. It built a situation in which the government attacks itself. But this is the detail that Washington is watching most carefully and most anxiously. A cornered regime does not always play rationally. A military faction that has identified its own survival as separate from the country's survival, that is watching its economic empire shrink and its proxy networks evaporate, and its own personnel abandon their posts, does not always choose the option that minimizes damage. Sometimes it chooses the option that maximizes chaos, because in chaos, the IRGC retains the suppression capacity that gives it relevance. In chaos, the civilian population is too frightened to protest. In chaos, the diplomatic faction cannot negotiate because there is nothing stable enough to negotiate around. Vahid's calculation may not be save Iran. It may be survive the collapse by controlling the collapse. And that calculation, applied by a man with his personal history, commanding an organization with its institutional structure, in a country with its nuclear capabilities, is what keeps American analysts watching every signal from Tehran with the particular attention that only the most dangerous possible scenarios generate. The streets are burning. The soldiers are deserting. The wells are filling. The diplomats are afraid. The generals are firing on tankers while the foreign minister announces peace. And the man who is supposed to make the final decision cannot open his eyes. The clock is running. Washington is waiting. And Iran is running out of time to decide whether the regime survives by making a deal or collapses trying to avoid one.
Ever since the Great Awakening, thousands of content creators like myself have been burning the midnight oil well into the wee hours of the morning, and millions of us who are awake are not getting enough sleep. Everyone knows that a good night's sleep is essential for efficient functioning of the cognitive processes that enable a person to discern truth from fiction and deep state-induced woke dementia. Well, years before I was asked to be an advertiser for MyPillow, I have been using their products. The first product I used was, of course, the pillows. I was impressed with the comfort, and I was able to fall off to sleep almost immediately rather than having to fight a bag of foam and trying to get comfortable. The pillowcases and Giza sheets are absolutely the bee's knees, and I have sets for the 2 beds I have in my home. Another thing is their body pillow. I suffer from a lumbar spine injury that is exacerbated by my preference to sleep on my side. Having the body pillow to roll onto alleviates the pressure and mitigates the discomfort, allowing me to fall asleep quickly. Mike Lindell, a great American patriot, has an entire line of quality products that everyone should try. Once you sleep with the pillows and sheets, you'll throw the ones you have in the garbage or donate them to Goodwill. If you go to www.mypillow.com, there is a link in the description. As a viewer and subscriber to this channel, you can buy anything in the store for 66% off. That's 1/3 of the retail price. Just fill your shopping cart and use promo code N4T at the checkout. Take it from me, folks, I've been using Mike Lindell's products since 2015. There is nothing like them on the market, and I say this with 71 years of sleeping experience. Don't forget, use promo code N4T at checkout.